to tell you the downsides of dopamine and why serotonin is much better. First, I want to show you this picture that compares the two neurotransmitters. Dopamine only has 5 receptors in the brain, whereas serotonin touches 14 receptors all throughout the brain, which shows it has a larger impact than dopamine. I'm going to skip this first bullet point and come back to it later. The next one mentions how dopamine is short-term while serotonin is long-term. Dopamine is triggered by short acts of pleasure, whereas serotonin is produced by long-term satisfaction and being content with what you have. Similarly, another point on this chart is that dopamine is fueled by taking. It's associated with selfish pleasure, whereas serotonin is associated with giving to others and spreading happiness in order to fuel happiness yourself, which ties back to the long-term satisfaction versus the short-term pleasure. Along with this, dopamine is generally experienced while doing things alone like eating or shopping, while serotonin comes from being around your loved ones and building relationships, which is a much healthier way to find happiness in life as opposed to being alone seeking short-term effects. The last point on this chart is the one I want to use to tie back to the first example that I skipped over. The last one states that dopamine makes the brain say, "This feels good, I want more," while serotonin makes the brain say, "This feels good and it's enough." This is such an important comparison between the two of them because it shows how these chemicals truly affect us. With serotonin, you're satisfied with the happiness that you have. There's no need to go looking for anything more because you are content. With dopamine, I've said it a million times, but it's so important that it's short-term. It doesn't last, and it's going to leave you wanting more and more every time to try to recreate its feeling. This is why dopamine is said to be addictive. Now, I do want to point out that dopamine itself isn't addictive, but rather its effects on the body and brain are addictive. High levels of dopamine can lead to feelings of euphoria and bliss, so exposure to the things that increase dopamine can become addictive. These experiences that make you feel good activate your brain's reward center, which responds by releasing dopamine. This release causes your brain to focus more of its attention on that specific experience. As a result, you're left with a strong memory of the pleasure you felt, which can prompt you to make an effort to experience it again by seeking out that certain activity. This can include things like drug and alcohol abuse, gambling, and even shopping, which is a very real addiction because of dopamine. Harold Seit from the Medical University of Vienna Institute of Pharmacology explained that dopamine release is responsible for people becoming addicted in that they are always seeking pleasure so that they can reach higher and higher dopamine levels. Dopamine is the reason why a lot of people are constantly seeking to satisfy their cravings. He mentions them wanting to reach higher and higher dopamine levels since dopamine plays a large role in developing tolerance to drugs and alcohol. Consistent drug misuse eventually leads to overstimulation in the reward center, and its pathways will become overwhelmed, which makes it harder for it to handle the high levels of dopamine being released. When this happens, the brain tries to solve it in one of two ways: decreasing dopamine production or reducing dopamine receptors. Either change generally results in the substance having less effect due to the weaker response from the brain's reward center. Still, the craving to use the drugs and alcohol will remain, it just takes more to satisfy it. Shane pointed out in his video that dopamine is responsible for helping your brain know certain survival. For example, he said dopamine helps tell you that you need to eat. But, as I said in my video, serotonin's what helps you control how much you eat and avoid overeating by increasing its levels in your gut. Dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter, and it promotes impulsivity for short-term happiness and pleasure, as opposed to serotonin, which is inhibitory and makes sure your body processes remain under control and promote general well-being. Without serotonin, dopamine would tell your body to keep eating and you wouldn't be able to stop, which would lead to further complications. Some other notable problems with dopamine are Parkinson's disease, fatigue, forgetfulness, obesity, and some of its symptoms associated with depression, such as lack of motivation, difficulty concentrating, hopelessness, helplessness, and loss of interest in activities, which are all associated with low dopamine levels. Other problems include mania, hallucinations, schizophrenia, and psychosis, which are all associated with too much dopamine. My last point I want to talk about is depression. While the exact cause of depression has not been pinpointed since there are many factors that contribute to it, both low serotonin and low dopamine are associated with some of the symptoms of depression. However, we can see in Shane's video that there doesn't appear to be a long-term treatment for depression using dopamine. However, serotonin-affecting medicines have been clinically proven to help treat depression long-term through the use of SSRIs and SNRIs. Serotonin can be responsible for causing symptoms of depression, but it can be used effectively in medicine to treat symptoms and the disease itself, while dopamine can cause the problems but not provide a solution to fix them.